Okay, I'm going to demonstrate sharpening hook knives. Now, there are two main types of hook knives. There are hook knives that have rails, and there are hook knives that don't have rails. Hook knives that don't have rails have a bevel on the outside that you should sharpen. Hook knives that do have rails, you sharpen on the inside, and there's a bevel on the outside, but you generally don't touch that really at all. I'm going to start with the one that's on the outside. And this, the reason you sharpen these on the outside is that if you sharpen them on the inside, what you're doing is you're making the hook narrower and narrower and narrower, and eventually it'll lose all its strength and snap. So by sharpening the bevel, what you're doing is slowly making it narrower in this dimension, not thinner. Whereas because these with the rails have a belly between the rails, as you go down this dimension, you're just making it narrower that way. But the fact that you're not removing material from the belly, you're just removing material from the rails, protects it from getting too thin and delicate. So, as with all of my process, where's some sandpaper, I like to use sandpaper, and I like to do it all up in the air. I have seen an interesting way of sharpening where somebody held the hook knife like this and then used sandpaper wrapped around a dowel and went like that. And I think that has some merit because this can wiggle a little bit, and you can pay attention to whether that dowel is truly flat on the bevel pretty well from looking down at like this. The way that I prefer to do it, and the reason I like doing it this way is because it happens real close to my face, is I hold the, get a little closer, I hold the hook knife like this so that I can see down it, and then I do two motions. The hook knife is going to come down, and the block is going to wrap up and around. So it looks like that. Now I want you to notice that the hook knife is at about a 45-degree angle on the block, so it's not straight up and down like this, and it's not like this. It's a 45-degree angle, and that's going to allow me to get a good motion across the blade while at the same time traveling from one side of the blade to the other side of the blade. I don't have it here, but with something that's really hooked over like a Mora, you generally, depending on what you're using it for, you generally only use, if this is the hook knife blade, you only use here to here. So I wouldn't bother sharpening right at the tip unless you find yourself needing to use it. But here to here, you know, essentially where this blade is where you're actually going to use the edge. So I wouldn't mess around too much down here, right at the handle, and I wouldn't go much past about here, even if the blade extends further, because generally that's not going to get dull. So even if you are using it, and you occasionally need to use that part, if it arrives from the maker sharp, you trying to sharpen it and learning how to sharpen it will generally dull it more. And so unless it's dull from you actually using it, don't try and sharpen it. I tend to sharpen my hook knives maybe a little, I was going to say a little less frequently than my sloids, but that's maybe not true. I sharpen them about the same amount as my sloids, in that I tend to sharpen them all together every 5 to 10 spoons. And I strop as well, because the hook knife really needs to be even in better condition than the sloid knife, because you're asking it to do weird things in the grain. It needs to be able to go up the grain some, more so than you ask the sloid knife to do, so it really needs to be at the pinnacle of sharpness. So here's what that motion looks like this. So you can see there's very little motion here. If I tried to do all the motion with this hand, it gets weird in your wrist. Likewise, if you do it down like this, where you're holding it and you're trying to essentially go like that, your fingers are covering up the edge. You can't see if the edge is truly flat on the sharpening surface, whether it's sandpaper or a water stone or whatever. With this, I can actually see, because it's right in front of my nose. Here, I'll turn it sideways so you guys can see that a little bit better. I can see when this edge, there we go, there's some light. Let's get this turned a little bit so we get some light on this. I can see when this edge is truly flat on the sandpaper, and there will be one point of contact that travels down the length of the blade as I go like this. And I can actually pay attention to it because it's right there. It's not that I'm trying to get this bevel totally flat. This bevel has some rounding to it, so you really need to make sure that the block is actually, let's see if I can show this to you. There we go. That the block is actually on the edge. And you can see that means being slightly off the back of the bevel. And you can actually see this in the scratch marks as well. You can see that the scratch marks don't extend to the back of this bevel here. Right? So, here's what that motion looks like again. Now, how do you know you've gone far enough? You know you've gone far enough when you form a burr on the inside edge. And the reason it's nice to feel for a burr is that you can tell where you have it. I have it right here. And where you don't have it. I don't yet have it at the tip. Usually it takes the longest to form the burr at the tip. So keep going with that lowest grit. In this case this is 600, but 400, 800, that's fine. You can do 1,000 if all you have is 1,000 grit water stone, for instance. It's just going to take you longer. And you want to go just until you form that burr. That burr tells you that you've eliminated any secondary bevel rounding that was on the very edge of the blade, because the burr won't form until that secondary edge is eliminated. So that's why it forms some places sooner than others. And once you feel that burr, then you can go up in the grits. Let me go on my sandpaper now. It's behind it because I so cleverly moved. You can start walking your way up in the grits. And again, same to everything else. You want to sort of roughly double the grit count and do 10 to 15 strokes. And if you're doing more than doubling, so in this case I'm jumping from 600 to 2,000, I'm going to do twice as many. And see how, once you know what that feels like, it's pretty swift motion. And notice that this is traveling down at that 45-degree angle the entire time. It's not like this. Because if it's like this, you tend to migrate off the paper. You tend to fall backwards off the paper this way, in which case you come close to cutting your fingers. And if it's too steep like this, then you have a harder time rounding. So the 45 is what gets you the ability to round and come down like this. Okay, and then, where is that? There we go. So then we do the 3,000, and again I used to go up to 3,000, and call it good. I then would strop just with automotive polish or metal polish on the, sorry, it's just metal polish like what you use to polish silver, right on this block. But then I found that to be really messy. It was getting all over my hands, getting a lot of smudging on my spoons. I mean, you need to wash your hands after you sharpen anyways, but it was excessive. So then I bought some strops, and we'll go into how I use strops after that. So once you've done your lowest grit, now notice that the back of this is not perfectly polished. It's polished right at the edge, and then there's a rough part where there's more scratch marks, and then there's a spot at the back right here that has relatively little. That doesn't really matter. The thing that affects how smooth the bowl of the spoon is what's happening right at the edge. So I'm not super concerned about there being larger scratch marks a little bit back from the edge. That's fine. So then, final thing is to remove the burr on the inside. The burr will be reduced at this point because it just sort of naturally comes off a little bit as you're going down through the grits. But then you want to use a dowel that's a narrower diameter than the curve. And essentially, you want to make sure the dowel is perfectly flat on that blade. And you do a push and a twist several times, making sure it's totally flat. Because if you are angled at all, it's gonna mess with that edge you just created. So you want it to be totally flat, and it's a push and a twist. And that's going to remove that burr on the inside. You can also use a ceramic honing rod, like what you would use in a kitchen, perhaps. And there we go. So that is sharpening this type of knife. Now, I'm going to get into stropping in a minute. But let's talk about sharpening the other type of knife. So for the other type of knife, I need to lower this down. Okay. For the other type of knife, everything is the same in terms of sandpaper and what grit sandpapers to use. I also use a dowel, and the nice thing about this method is that when you're using the sandpaper wrapped around the wooden block, there's always a bit at the edge that you can't quite get to because you can't hold it safely. Your thumb would be up too high. Well, that's exactly the part that's going to get used in this part. So it really uses every last scrap of your sandpaper quite efficiently. So hook knives with the rail system get sharpened on the inside. And here's the important thing about that. If you lock this down, either by putting it on a table, clamping it in a vise, whatever, then there's only one angle that is the correct angle to do. And so you are less likely to be perfectly precise over time if you do it this way. If instead you hold it up so that it can wiggle, but have it be on something narrow enough so that the dowel can wiggle with it, then the dowel will be self-leveling. And the dowel will essentially create a system where it will ride with the bevel every time. And again, it's that same push and twist. The push is important because it helps create a burr, which tells you when you've eliminated that secondary bevel at the edge. And the twist is important because it gets you from one end of the blade, from the back of the blade to the tip. So you need both. It can't just be this, which is what I see a lot of. And obviously it can't just be this. I think most people realize it can't be that. So most people get the twist, but they don't have enough push. So make sure you have a push. Now notice I put the sandpaper right on one end of the dowel. And this dowel is about 8 inches long. And the reason I did that was so that the other end of the dowel could come up against the heel of my hand here, which helps my hand stay relaxed. If I put the sandpaper in the middle, then my fingers either come up against the blade because I'm holding the whole thing in the middle, or if I put it back here, then I have to pinch really hard to hold it in place because I don't have it pressing against the heel of my hand. So put the sandpaper at one end of the dowel, pinch it right in the middle, which is at one end of the sandpaper, and notice that I have my thumb up so that I can rock up on the tip. If you do this, you're going to be doing some awkward stuff with your arm. So thumb up like this, have it on either a block on your knee. I know Nick Westerman uses an armchair that has an arm right here, and he does it on the arm. And that's how, just by chance, he figured out this system of rocking and how it self-levels. Or if you have a vise, you can clamp a block into a vise on a workbench and work it that way. I like this because I can do it anywhere, and it just uses the tools that I already have. So, again, starting with the lowest grit, and it's a nice push and a twist, just like that. And what I'm going to be feeling for is that burr. I don't want to go crazy because every stroke you take when sharpening is an opportunity for you to mess things up. So you want to do as little as possible while doing the right amount. I know that sounds like a conundrum. So this feels good here, but I don't yet have a burr at the tip. This is why the burr method is useful. So now I'm just going to concentrate just on the tip of the knife. So you want to do as little as possible while doing enough to actually eliminate any secondary bevel. Okay. Good. Now, I'm going to walk my way up through the grits. So, in this case, go to the 2000. Notice I have the knife in my hand. If I were going to put the knife down, put a sheath on it. Okay? Always, always, always sheath your tools, even if you're putting them down for just a second. Because that's what happens. Right there. Case in point. Perfect. Okay. So, if I want to not put the sheath on it, that's fine. It just needs to stay in my hand while I do this other stuff. Don't let it out of your hand. But also, if it's floating around, be aware of where it is. I've had times where I've had things in my hand, I like picked up a cup of coffee and got a knife real close to my face just because I had the habit of not letting it leave my hand, but then I didn't have the habit of paying attention to where the blade actually was. So, the next grit. And again, I'm not removing the burr. The burr will get reduced, and then I'll remove it at the very end with the lowest grit. But now it's just about replacing the scratch patterns. So I'm not feeling for the burr anymore. I'm using some medium pressure here. But most important, I'm making sure that this is actually truly on both bevels. You can feel it sort of click back and forth. Click, 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 and then I can tell when it's on both. So you got to make sure it's on both. Otherwise you're going to be changing your edge geometry, and you don't want to do that. Okay, again, a few more strokes than usual because the sandpaper I have is jumping pretty high in the grits. And now we go to the 3000. Okay, again, holding the spoon knife in my hand, or put a sheath on it. Okay, now, you should still have a bevel on the outside, and here is how I remove that bevel. I hold the knife up like this, just like that. And I put this part of the sandpaper here. The reason I do it here is that I can tell if I'm too far, then I'm going to destroy the edge I have. If I'm not far enough, let's get it where you can actually see. If I'm not far enough, how do I show this? Then you see how I'm not actually on the edge there? But I can see when it's right in front of my eyes when I am perfectly on the edge and not too far. So what I do is maintaining that angle of the dowel. Once I establish it, I then do several passes like this, and you can feel that wire edge come off. It's like zip is how it feels when it's coming off. So again, if you're too far like this, you're not even going to be touching the edge. If you're too far like this, you're going to be destroying your edge. So you can see when you hold it in front of your face like this, if you have the correct angle. So to recap, and then you can feel with your thumb, no more bevel. This is now ready for stropping. To recap, knives that have the bevel on the outside, you go until you feel the burr on the inside. Then you walk your way up through the grits, and then you remove the burr on the inside using a dowel. Knives that have the two rail systems, you sharpen on the inside until you feel the burr on the outside. Then you walk your way up through the grits, and then you remove the burr on the outside, either using the dowel. Matt likes to use strop against it like this. I don't like doing that. Come up with a system that works for you, but the main thing is understanding what needs to happen and understanding how to isolate your movements and pay attention to the things that matter and let the things that don't matter go. I think I'm going to do stropping in a separate video because this is already 20 minutes. So look for that.